Usually, when we talk about a piece of media going viral today, we picture a very specific kind of modern architecture, right?
Oh, absolutely. We think of like massive server farms just humming out in the desert somewhere.
Yeah, or complex algorithms, transatlantic fiber optic cables, billions of smartphones glowing in the dark.
Right. We treat virality like it's this inherently digital phenomenon, like it belongs exclusively to our era of, microchips and satellites.
Exactly. The assumption is always that mass media manipulation requires the invention of the internet to actually work on a global scale.
Which is completely understandable, but stepping into the world of the late 19th century just completely obliterates that assumption.
It really does. I mean, all that digital architecture vanishes, and you're left looking at this media landscape that's powered by, honestly, horse sweat, fragile glass plates, and volatile chemical explosions.
Yeah, it was messy, super physical infrastructure, but the people operating within it were pulling off media manipulation and viral stunts that, modern PR firms would be incredibly jealous of.
Oh, for sure. So, for you listening today, welcome to this custom-tailored deep dive, because we are going to explore that explosive evolution of 19th century media.
It's going to be a wild ride. We're tracing the whole journey.
Yeah, going from the agonizingly slow days of horse-bound couriers all the way to the lightning speed of the electric telegraph.
And we'll get into the surprisingly pragmatic, almost accidental origins of objective journalism.
Right. And then we'll see how this entirely new landscape was basically weaponized by this flamboyant cavalry officer.
George Armstrong Custer.
Exactly. Who essentially engineered himself into America's first modern influencer.
Which is such a crazy concept to think about.
It is. And real quick, just to give you an overview of the stack of sources we're pulling from for this deep dive, we've got historical accounts of the telegraph's invention, the founding records of the Associated Press, military communication logs from the Civil War, and the really fascinating logs and records from the 1874 Black Hills expedition.
Yeah, those expedition records are incredible.
Mm.
But, to really understand the magnitude of what someone like Custer accomplished, we kind of have to start by establishing the sheer physical whiplash society
Oh,
experienced.
the culture shock.
Exactly. When communication shifted from the speed of a horse to the speed of an electron.
Hmm.
Because for the entirety of human existence up to that point, information was bound by physical mass.
Right. A message could only travel as fast as a human being. A horse or a ship could physically carry it across the land or ocean.
Right, and the historical records from the early 1840s give us this statistic that perfectly captures how paralyzing that limitation was.
Oh, the Harrison thing.
Yes. So when President William Henry Harrison died in office in 1841, it took a staggering 110 days for the news of his death to reach Los Angeles.
Wait, 110 days?
Yeah, almost 4 months.
That is just, it's wild to think about. It's like going straight from writing physical letters to using instant messaging overnight.
Exactly, 110 days of complete political and social disconnect.
You could have a whole war declared or an economic collapse in the East, and the West Coast is just oblivious.
They'd continue operating under a completely obsolete reality. People are out there conducting business, signing contracts, making life-altering decisions based on information that was essentially a historical artifact by the time they heard it.
So then Samuel F.B. Morse comes along, right? He secures his patent for the electromagnetic telegraph in 1840.
Right. But having a patent and actually rewiring a nation are two very different things. Morse was totally broke.
He needed government backing.
Desperately. He needed a large-scale test circuit, so he specifically asked Congress for $30,000 to build a double wire circuit between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore.
And Congress was, what, totally skeptical, I assume?
Oh, incredibly skeptical. The prevailing attitude was that sending invisible messages over a wire was just a scientific dead end, or like a parlor trick to fleece the taxpayers.
Because infrastructure back then meant canals and dirt roads, not invisible electricity.
Right, so giving him $30,000 for this unproven, abstract technology required a massive leap of faith. But they finally pushed the funding through in what the sources call the expiring hour of the 1843 session.
Wow, just under the wire, pun intended.
Nice one. And a year later, in 1844, Morse transmits that famous first message.
What hath God wrought? from numbers 23.23, which is just so dramatic.
It's beautifully dramatic, a great way to open a new era of human connectivity.
Hmm.
But more importantly, it proved the physics actually worked.
And once that proof of concept was there, the expansion was just basically a detonation. Right?
Totally. By the end of the 1840s, there were 20,000 miles of wire.
Mm.
And by 1861, going into the Civil War, there were over 50,000 miles of wire in operation.
50,000 miles in just a couple of decades.
Yeah. And that expansion was inextricably linked to the railroads. They functioned as this symbiotic network crisscrossing the American landscape at the same time.
So the railroads provided the telegraph lines with the physical right-of-way, I'm guessing?
Exactly. They transported the heavy iron wire and the wooden poles. And in return, the telegraph gave the railroads the ability to actually schedule trains and dispatch cars.
Oh, right, because otherwise you just have trains barreling down the same track towards each other.
Exactly. It prevented catastrophic collisions on single track lines by letting them communicate ahead of the locomotives.
Okay, so society is just forcefully accelerated into instantaneous transmission. That sudden collapse of space and time, was it completely disorienting for society and its institutions?
It absolutely fractured established norms, especially international diplomacy.
How so?
Well, historically, foreign ministries relied heavily on the sheer slowness of communication as a diplomatic tool. They basically weaponized delay.
Oh, I see. Because it took weeks for messages to cross oceans, they had a built-in cooling-off period.
Exactly. If a crisis flared up, tempers had time to cool. It gave leaders this mandated window to think methodically, consult advisors, craft a measured solution without the pressure of having to respond immediately.
But the telegraph completely strips that buffer away. You can't claim you need a month to think about it when they know you got their message 3 seconds after they send it.
Right. And by 1859, the British Foreign Office found themselves so overwhelmed by this new pace that they had to hire resident clerks specifically to handle telegrams arriving after the close of business.
Wow, literally changing the working hours of the government.
Yeah, it forced this new reactivity that just hadn't existed in statecraft before.
So the telegraph rewired the psychology of business and diplomacy in peacetime. But from the sources, it seems like its true test of scale came during the Civil War.
Oh, absolutely. The American Civil War became the absolute crucible for this technology. The desperate need for fast information transformed military strategy and civilian journalism.
Let's talk about the military side first, because the U.S. Army Signal Corps under Albert Meyer laid over 15,000 miles of line during the war.
They did, but the wildest part was how they engineered it to function in active combat, shifting it from, static infrastructure to a mobile tactical asset.
Right, the telegraph trains. When I first read that, I pictured literal locomotives.
Yeah, a lot of people do. But they were actually specialized light wagons drawn by horses directly onto the battlefield.
So they would have one wagon stay stationary as the receiving station, and another wagon would drive out, just spooling out copper wire.
Up to 5 miles of insulated copper wire on these iron lances. They called them flying telegraph lines.
But wait, didn't traditional telegraphs use those heavy glass batteries filled with acid? How do you put that in a bouncy wooden wagon in the middle of a war?
You don't. That was a recipe for disaster, so they had to adapt. This engineer named Henry J. Rogers brought in the Beardsley magneto-electric telegraph.
The Beardsley device. Okay, how did that work without acid?
It eliminated the acid batteries entirely. Instead of a chemical reaction, the operator literally just turned a hand crank.
Oh, wow. So human-powered electricity.
Exactly. The physical rotation revolved internal magnets to generate current through electromagnetic induction. And the best part was, it bypassed the need for specialized Morse code operators.
Because Morse code is hard to learn, right? You need highly trained people.
Very hard. But the Beardsley had this circular index plate printed with the alphabet. So a soldier just moved a pointer to the desired letter, sent a pulse, and a synchronized pointer on the receiving machine stopped at the exact same letter.
So any soldier who could read could operate it in the field. That is brilliant.
It was. And they were also pushing the vertical limits of the tech. Have you read about Thaddeus Lowe?
The hot air balloon guy. Yes. In 1861, he set up air-to-ground telegraph communication from a hot air balloon.
Which is just insane to picture. Ascending high above the Virginia battlefields, observing Confederate movements, and tapping out coordinates down the tether line to the ground forces.
It's a brilliant concept, but I mean, you're dangling in a massive balloon. Weren't they just giant targets?
Huge targets, highly visible to Confederate soldiers with rifled muskets. Between the physical danger and the logistical nightmare of generating hydrogen gas in the field, the military largely abandoned the balloon corps by 1863.
Makes sense. Now, meanwhile, Off the battlefield, President Abraham Lincoln is seeing the value of this.
Oh, he was obsessed. He practically lived in the War Department's telegraph office, waiting for what he called lightning messages.
Because for the first time, a sitting president has real-time command and control over his generals. He's talking directly to Ulysses S. Grant.
Exactly. But Lincoln also knew this speed could be weaponized against the Union, which is why his government established strict press censorship and basically took possession of the commercial telegraph wires.
Which brings us to the civilian side, because the public's demand for news was insatiable during the war.
Completely. People were desperate for news about the battles, casualties, just wanting to know if their family members were okay. And this desperation leads directly to the Associated Press.
Right. Now, the AP had technically formed earlier, in 1848, right?
Right. 6 competing New York City newspapers got together because the costs of independent telegraph dispatches were just financially crushing them.
It's like a modern wholesale distributor. They formed a cooperative to share the overhead.
Exactly. But as this network expanded during the pressure cooker of the Civil War, it inadvertently created the modern standard for objective news.
And this is fascinating to me because the sources show that objectivity wasn't some high-minded philosophical ideal.
Not at all. It was raw economic necessity. Because the AP was serving newspapers across the entire political spectrum, from staunch abolitionist papers to papers sympathetic to Southern states' rights. They couldn't afford a partisan slant.
Right. If you add political flavor, you alienate half your paying retail partners.
Exactly. We have this great quote from Lawrence Gobright, the AP's first Washington correspondent. He testified before Congress in 1862.
What did he say?
He said, "My business is merely to communicate facts. I therefore confine myself to what I consider legitimate news."
That's essentially the foundational blueprint for modern wire service reporting, just stripping away the editorializing to provide a raw product.
Yeah, and the local editors could frame it however they wanted later.
But the physical logistics of this blow my mind. You've got a single AP dispatch arriving via telegraph. How does that single message reach dozens of competing papers at the exact same time before modern copying machines?
It was an intensely physical, labor-heavy process called manifolding.
Manifolding. Okay, how did that work?
So a writer in the manifolding room would assemble this dense stack of really tough, heavily oiled tissue paper, and between each sheet, they'd interleave a sheet of carbonized paper coated in this dark pigment.
But if you write on that with a normal steel pen or a pencil, wouldn't it just shred the thin paper?
Oh, it would completely destroy it.
Yeah.
So they used a smooth gemstone stylus, typically an agate or a carnelian point.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and the writer would press down with immense physical force, writing in these broad, sweeping strokes to drive the impression through all the carbon layers. They could make 12 to 26 copies at once.
That sounds exhausting. And then what? Messengers just grab them?
Yep, office assistants would tear the stack apart, seal the flimsy sheets in envelopes, and hand them to waiting messengers who would literally sprint through the city streets. So all the newspapers got the breaking news at the exact same moment.
That is wild. So the telegraph is accelerating the written word and making it objective. But at the same time, the public is starting to demand visual proof of these events.
Right. Reading a factual account is one thing, but people wanted to see the devastation, which pushed 19th century photography out of the portrait studio and onto the battlefield.
And the contrast here is amazing. The telegraph operator is dealing with invisible electrons, but the field photographer is dragging around a clunky mobile chemistry lab.
It was agonizingly difficult. The primary method was the wet plate collodion process.
Right, so they take a heavy glass plate, hand-coat it with this syrupy collodion mixture, and dunk it in silver nitrate to make it light-sensitive.
Exactly. Then they load this dripping wet plate into a massive wooden camera, expose it, which required subjects to stay completely still for several seconds, and then rush it back to a portable darkroom wagon.
And they were on a brutal time crunch.
Oh, absolutely. They had roughly a 10-minute window from the moment it was coated to the moment it had to be developed. If the emulsion dried, the image was totally lost.
Doing a delicate chemical ballet in the sweltering heat, under enemy fire sometimes, it's like trying to operate a mobile chemistry lab in the middle of a bumper car arena.
That's a perfect analogy. But despite all that friction, these images carried a profound psychological weight with the public, especially with the stereoscope.
Oh, the 3D viewers. Invented by Charles Wheatstone and popularized by Oliver Wendell Holmes.
Right. It became a massive hit in middle-class parlors. You look through the lenses at 2 slightly offset photos, and it creates this vivid illusion of depth. It made flat images immersive.
But wasn't there a danger to that immersion? I mean, 19th century audiences viewed these photos as absolute empirical truth.
They had an almost naive trust in the image. They thought the camera couldn't lie. But the truth is, the framing was often highly manipulated by the photographers.
Yeah, the source material on Edward S. Curtis is a perfect example. He's famous for these sweeping portraits of Native Americans, but the records show he actually carried a supply of dark, flowing wigs with him.
Yes, because if his indigenous subjects had haircuts that reflected their actual contemporary assimilated lives, Curtis would literally ask them to wear the wigs.
He's actively stripping away their reality to construct an image for his Victorian audience.
He knew it sold.
Yeah.
The noble, vanishing savage. And he was willing to use costumes to provide that manufactured authenticity.
Which really makes you wonder, if photographers are staging scenes and carrying costume props, did early photography actually misinform the public more than the written word did? I mean, at least the AP had a financial reason to stick to the facts.
I'd argue the visual medium was undeniably more insidious, yeah?
Yeah.
Because the artificiality was masked by the machine. The public believed in the mechanical objectivity of the camera.
The photograph smuggles its commentary under the guise of proof.
Exactly. And this manufactured visual dominance paved the way for things like Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows. It let Eastern audiences safely consume this myth of the West while ignoring the harsh realities of displacement and warfare.
Right. Okay, so post-Civil War, this mass media infrastructure is established in the U.S., but the drive to connect didn't stop there. They wanted to wire the whole globe.
The transatlantic cable of 1866. A monumental engineering nightmare.
Manufacturing thousands of miles of copper wire, insulating it with gutta percha.
Which is a newly discovered latex, crucial for surviving the crushing pressure and corrosive saltwater.
And they used the Great Eastern, right, the largest iron steamship in the world at the time?
Yeah, to carry the immense weight of the spool. And when it finally linked Ireland to Newfoundland, people went crazy. They called it the eighth wonder of the world.
It's essentially the 19th century equivalent of the internet going global overnight. The geopolitical implications must have been massive.
Seismic. The U.S. State Department had to establish a dedicated telegraph office in 1866 just to handle the international data.
But wait, earlier we talked about how losing that diplomatic delay was destabilizing. Did this transatlantic cable make things safer? Or did the pressure for instant responses create more volatility?
It undeniably heightened the volatility. The margin for error evaporated. A poorly translated telegram could trigger an army mobilization before anyone could even clarify.
Plus, the sheer cost of sending messages across the ocean changed how they wrote.
Right, they had to be hyper-concise, stripping away all the nuance of diplomatic language to save money. And they had to use complex codes because spies were actively tapping the physical lines.
Wow. Okay, so the architecture is fully assembled. We have an instantaneous text network, international connection, a public obsessed with visual media they think is truth, and a 24-hour news cycle.
All it needs is a personality who intuitively understands how to play the system.
Enter George Armstrong Custer.
Yes, Custer is the perfect avatar for the dawn of the mass media age. He operated less like a military officer and more like America's first modern influencer.
His rebranding after the Civil War was wild. He goes from the boy general in velvet uniforms to this carefully curated Indian hunter.
Complete with a custom-tailored Daniel Boone buckskin suit. He knew exactly what visual archetype the Eastern press wanted.
But his real genius was how he used the telegraph, right?
His subversive use of the iron wire? Yes. He recognized that the military chain of command was too slow for the media age, so he just bypassed it.
He would go out into the Dakota frontier and basically leak thrilling accounts of his own exploits to his favorite reporters via the closest telegraph.
Exactly. So these sensational tales of his heroics hit the front pages in New York before President Ulysses S. Grant even got the official military reports.
He's controlling the initial narrative.
Because he knew the first version of the story is the one that sticks.
He also used pseudonyms, like he wrote for sportsmen's magazines under the name Nomad, and he even penned an anonymous smear letter to the New York Herald.
To publicly attack his own subordinate, Major Marcus Reno, settling internal grudges through the national press.
It's like a modern celebrity dropping an anonymous tweet to settle a petty grudge. How does a military officer get away with this blatant insubordination?
Well, he recognized he didn't just command a regiment, he commanded a narrative. He published his book, My Life on the Plains, which was heavily serialized in a magazine.
Right, which wasn't just an adventure memoir. The sources show it was basically propaganda to justify the Indian Wars, framing Native Americans as the cultural enemy of white Europeans.
He was giving a philosophical rationale for his brutal campaigns, knowing Eastern settlers would eat it up. And he survived the insubordination because he made himself too famous to discipline.
Ah, he built a public shield.
Exactly.
Mm.
Any politician, even President Grant, who tried to punish him, knew there would be massive public backlash. Custer leveraged the media to outmaneuver the entire military hierarchy.
Which brings us to the absolute peak of his media manipulation, the 1874 Black Hills expedition.
A masterclass in hype.
Ostensibly, this was just a routine scouting mission, right? General Terry ordered him to explore the Black Hills to find a spot for a future fort.
Right, in unmapped territory belonging to the Lakota people under the Fort Laramie Treaty. But Custer doesn't pack for a quiet scouting mission.
He brings a literal brass band.
Playing his signature song, Gary Owen. He brings 1,000 soldiers, a train of wagons, 2 professional gold miners, 3 embedded reporters, and a commercial photographer, William H. Illingworth.
Oh, and President Grant's son, Fred Grant.
Political insurance.
It's a heavily produced 19th century reality TV show, and he's just creating viral moments. Like on August 7th, he shoots a grizzly bear.
And he claims it's his greatest hunting achievement, halts the whole column, and poses for dramatic stereoscopic photos with the carcass.
Reinforcing his brand as the conqueror. But the ultimate viral headline comes a few days later from those 2 gold miners he brought.
They find traces of gold. And the phrase Custer ensures hits the telegraph wires is just incredibly potent. Gold from the grassroots down.
Gold from the grassroots down. Perfect clickbait. Limitless wealth. Zero effort.
And how he got that message out is a story itself. He sends this frontier guide, Lonesome Charlie Reynolds, riding at night to Fort Laramie, the closest telegraph station.
And supposedly Reynolds put his horse's shoes on backward to evade detection.
That's the legend. But whether that's true or not, the result was catastrophic. The message hits the wire, the headlines spark a global gold rush, and thousands of white prospectors illegally invade the Black Hills.
Triggering the Black Hills War, a brutal conflict with the Lakota, and the thing is, Custer knew this would happen.
He wasn't naive. He wrote this remarkably reflective letter to the New York Times admitting the cost.
Yeah, let me quote this part from the sources. He writes, "We are goading the Indians to madness by invading their hallowed grounds." And he goes on to say the revenge would far outweigh any scientific or political benefit.
It's chilling.
It really is. So did he actually care about the science or the fort? Or was this purely an ego trip?
It's complex. I mean, they did get legitimate data. The geologists got samples. Illingworth took 70 high-quality photos that ecologists still use today. But undeniably, the massive apparatus of the expedition was a stage for Custer's ambitions.
He wanted the spotlight.
He knew the gold headlines would make him the most famous man in America. But setting off that chain reaction directly sealed his own doom 2 years later.
Which leads to the final dark irony here. The contrast between that 1874 media circus and the 1876 Battle of the Little Bighorn.
Right. When Custer marched out in 1876, the atmosphere was entirely different. No brass band, no reporters, and crucially, no photographer.
Which is so weird for a guy who spent a decade courting the camera. Why leave them behind?
Because the 1876 campaign was designed as a fast, hard-hitting strike. There was no room in a rapid cavalry column for a slow darkroom wagon and delicate chemicals.
So the most famous battle of his life, his final stand, happens with zero visual documentation.
Exactly. The camera was absent. But the telegraph network he manipulated so well was still there, and it broadcast his destruction to the world almost instantaneously.
The news traveled by steamboat, the far west, down the river to Bismarck. Then it hit the wires and flashed to the East Coast right as the nation was celebrating the 1876 centennial in Philadelphia.
The psychological shock was immense. The nation is celebrating its 100th anniversary, feeling totally triumphant and modern, and suddenly they hear their invincible celebrity general has been wiped out.
It shattered his own narrative. But since he died, he couldn't spin it. He couldn't write an anonymous letter blaming someone else.
So who steps in to do the PR for a dead man?
His widow, Libbie Custer.
Yes. She lived until the 1930s and spent 6 decades acting as his unrelenting spin doctor. She wrote books, did lecture tours, and violently defended his legacy against any critique.
Making him a gallant martyr. But corporate America finalized the myth, Custerology.
Right, the Anheuser-Busch Brewing Company. In 1895, they commissioned a lithograph based on a painting called Custer's Last Fight.
The image is iconic, but totally divorced from reality. Custer in the center, heroic light, saber aloft, fighting to the last man.
And Anheuser-Busch mass-produced it and gave it out for free to tens of thousands of barrooms across America.
So generations of people stared at this totally inaccurate corporate artwork while having a beer. It introduced more people to his myth than any history book.
It proves the power of curated images. The architects of a narrative, a widow, or a beer company, can override historical facts if they use the media tools of their age effectively.
It really makes you ask, does empirical truth even matter once a media myth is that deeply established?
It seems truth operates at a severe disadvantage against a compelling visual narrative. The Telegraph provided the shock, but the image cemented the myth.
Wow. So we've gone from news taking 110 days to Morse's Telegraph, to the AP's objective journalism, the clunky birth of photojournalism, and Custer basically inventing the influencer playbook.
And getting consumed by the machine he helped build. The architecture of our instant information environment wasn't built by Silicon Valley engineers. It was built by 19th century telegraph operators, photographers in darkroom wagons, and cavalrymen chasing glory.
So next time you read a breaking news headline, or watch a live broadcast, or see a perfectly curated influencer post, remember the DNA of that media. It traces back to the copper wire, glass plates, and the Black Hills.
An unbroken thread of human ambition and narrative manipulation.
Now, before we sign off, I want to leave you with one final, very provocative thought. According to the sources, there's a fascinating detail about the vulnerability of this network.
Right. The telegraph lines were entirely exposed, just iron wire on wooden poles across the unpoliced frontier.
But the Native American tribes largely left them alone. They possess this deep superstition or apprehension about molesting the talking wires. So the lines often remained completely intact right through hostile territory.
The information lifeline of the expanding U.S. was allowed to operate unhindered by the people trying to stop that expansion.
So ask yourself, what if they hadn't held that superstition? What if they systematically dismantled the iron wire, plunging the military back into the dark ages of horse-bound communication?
Severing that blinding speed.
If the East Coast had been blinded to the realities of the frontier, would the entire myth of the American West and the tragic fate of the people living there have unfolded entirely differently, hidden from the instantaneous gaze of the modern world?
It really forces us to consider how the physical medium dictates human history.
It does. We started out talking about going viral. It turns out the original viral network wasn't code. It was iron wire, gutta percha, glass plates, and a massive amount of ambition. Thanks for taking the deep dive with us.